What we're going to talk about is what this title refers to, which is issues around identifying EBD, emotional and behavioral disorders, or emotional disability, I guess. If you travel more than 50 miles, you're going to find a different term for this category of disability. I use the term EBD. That's generally the professional term. So these are issues that are not new. It's not that a problem has emerged and we're going to set out to solve it and by next year we'll be in good shape. It's a series of issues that are chronic over decades, really. But I think talking about them helps us address them in the best way that we can, approach them professionally. Again, I'm not going to give you answers because I don't think there are answers, but if we keep those issues in mind as we work toward identifying and serving these students in the best way possible, I think we'll be in a better position. Here's what we're going to try to do. Talk about four things roughly. What is EBD? We're going to talk very quickly about definitions and eligibility, what it means to have an emotional and behavioral disorder from a school perspective. And there's some key distinctions there. We'll talk briefly about how many students there are who have EBD. That's prevalence. There's two issues going on there. How many have an emotional or behavioral disability is a different number than how many are identified by schools. And that's the key point we'll make. Third, do we identify the right students? I put that in quotes because I don't know what the right students are, and we would probably disagree. But we're going to talk about who is identified versus who isn't identified. And I want to make the point about false positives and false negatives. If you've heard that term before, it's not as convoluted as it might sound, but it's a really key element to what we do with kids who have EBD. And then what can we do, what can we say and do about disproportionality? Again, that's the thorny issue at the heart of all this, disproportionality. There's disproportional identification of minority students, primarily African American, in this category. We're going to talk about all the variations of disproportionality and at least talk briefly about the key reasons that it might occur, and then again get at some of the issues around solving that problem. Not an answer, but what we need to think about if we're going to move towards solving that problem. Good with that overview? All right, let's dive in. The federal definition, that's a lot of language, but if you've studied this, if you've taken a class, you've probably memorized a lot of this. This is and the reason I say you may have memorized it, it has not changed, and I believe 38 years since it was first enacted into law. They did tinker around the edge with emotional disturbance versus serious emotional disturbance, which is sort of a humorous switch. I don't know when it's a not so serious emotional disturbance, but the defining elements have not changed, again, for years and years and years. We're going to pick this apart briefly. I'm not going to read them all to you, but if you know them, familiar with this, like it's ingrained in your brain, you dream about it at night. Okay, so I'm not going to run through it verbatim, but just try to make my points. The term means you have to have one or more of these five things: inability to learn, inability to build satisfactory relationships. Raise your hand if you have a satisfactory interpersonal relationship with everyone in your life. Thank you. Yeah, well, let's take them one at a time, or not one at a time, but let's pick them apart slowly. I did want to throw up the definition used in Indiana. State definitions have to meet federal definitions. They almost all vary. I would love to be in the rooms when these states come up with these definitions that have to meet the federal definition, but they want to tinker with it because they have different nuanced understandings of particular words. So if you read this, you'll find it almost verbatim, but no, they had to switch it a little. I don't blame them for that. I'm sure there were great reasons and committees of really high-powered people coming up with why this word needed to be there. But it's basically the same definition. I studied over this trying to come up with, was there any key conceptual difference? And I haven't found one. Anybody aware of one? It's stuff just got moved around. The same things are there. So, okay, let's just move into the language. What are the problems with that definition? Okay, remember, one of the things we're talking about is issues in who's being identified and is there disproportional identification. Okay, if we're trying to figure out if we have problems with who's being identified, are we identifying the right kids, are we identifying too much of one group or not enough of another group, you have to start with, well, what's the definition? Well, as you probably know, I hope I'm preaching to the choir primarily here, but the biggest problem that's cited with this over and over and over is the terminology in that definition. You know, if you put this in a behavior intervention plan in a master's degree class, you would fail, okay? There's nothing operational in this definition. Now, I'm not saying there can be. If I had to write the federal law, I don't have one in my pocket that I can pull out and say, use this one. Now, I would recommend the alternative definition proposed by the National Mental Health and Special Education Coalition, published in '92, Fornes and Nitzer et al., which I'm sure you're familiar with, but we're not going to talk about today. But operationalizing it is difficult. Nonetheless, look at these terms. I'm going to try not to beat this dead horse. The terminology and the definition in that block, just a few of them, over a long period of time. What is a long period of time? A week, 6 months, a year? And I don't mean to gloss over these. If a child loses a pet, if a child has parents who are divorced or separated, or the child moves out of their apartment because they're being evicted on Thursday night and they have to be in school Friday morning, there's going to be events occurring that they're going to have reactions to. They're going to show up in school. A lot of those are normal reactions. Your friends, your colleagues will say to you, hey, you seem down, what's going on? Maybe a traumatic event in your life, personal life, family, has occurred, and maybe for a week, 2 weeks, a month, you're down in the dumps, you're distracted, you're depressed. I mean, maybe legitimately depressed. When do we worry about that? If you get over it in a week, I mean, that's a normal human thing. I mean, we all go through difficult times. So it's not bad, it's not wrong to have periods of depression, distraction, inability to focus on your work, sleepless nights, change in appetite. You know, all these things that go along with clinical depression can happen in minor episodes, and now we're talking about kids. They happen with kids too. Is there a line somewhere that says this is a normal reaction to stressful life events versus this kid's in trouble? There is a line. The problem is it's a very subjective line, and who draws it and when do we draw it? So that's what all of these are sort of alluding to. Where do we draw a line on a long period of time? What's a marked degree? Adversely affects educational performance, I want to come back to in a minute. First of all, I don't know what that means. Failing grades? Could be. How about missing school? They just quit showing up. How about their grades are actually okay, but they're getting in a lot of fights? That's an adverse effect on I mean, so can it be any or all of those things? I think it can. But again, we don't have a concrete idea of what that is. The satisfactory interpersonal relationships I already alluded to. I didn't have a lot of those when I was a kid. I wasn't obnoxious, mean, in trouble. I was very quiet, very shy, very reserved. But if you measured that in some way, people would have said, this guy has very few friends. He's very quiet. He doesn't engage in group, you know, on the playground. He's by himself or with one friend talking. I don't know if they would have thought that was a problem, but it wouldn't have been like every other kid, because they're all different. We're all unique in the way we form or don't form interpersonal relationships. General pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression I already alluded to, and that's a really important one. Depression is a real thing, and childhood depression is a very serious thing. Schools are not really in the business of treating depression. That's a psychiatric disorder that really needs the care of a psychiatrist, or certainly a clinical psychologist. I mean, if it's diagnosed depression, it needs the care of someone trained to do that. Now, schools have a role. We should be in tune with signs of depression. We should be helping to connect kids with services within school, guidance counselors, school psychologists, coordinating with other services if services are being provided, and providing everything a school's supposed to provide, which is a positive, supportive learning environment, you know, free of threats, bullying, harassment, those kind of things. But that's becoming even more important recently, I think. But what are the questions we're asking about this? So we can criticize the definition, and that's fine, and that's been criticized for years, and it's probably not going anywhere. That definition's, there's no change on the horizon. That definition's probably going to continue to exist for the foreseeable future. But what are the questions we're asking? Well, we want to know if the student has a disability according to that definition. But there's sort of two questions there. The second is, do they need special education? You know, in the law, the language is such that you might have a disability, but if it does not have an adverse effect on your educational performance, you may not qualify for services, for special education services. So there's two layers to that question. And remember what special education is. And this is the definition I use. It's out of textbooks, Hallahan and Kaufman, or whichever book you choose. But special education, it's in the law too, but maybe not in these words. It's specially designed instruction to meet the unique needs of a student with a disability. Well, if I think about depression, if that's the only sign or signal a kid's showing, they're not showing other issues, will special education help them? Will identification, yeah, I see most people kind of saying, yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think so. Now, that's not to say if I have a really good special ed teacher who has a really positive, engaging room or instructional approach or great rapport with kids, that I wouldn't, in the back of my mind, say, oh, I'd love to connect him with this teacher. But I've got to think about whether they qualify for services. So we've got this definitional issue floating out there that leaves us with a difficult challenge in identifying who we think we should identify. I'm not going through this one. This is the eligibility steps that you take in Indiana, just lifted from the law. But this really doesn't answer the question about who gets identified or how we interpret the definition. This is just the legalese that says do this, do this, do this. The assessment has to include academic functioning, emotional and behavioral functioning. You have to assess all these domains. So again, I don't want to skip over this, but this doesn't help me determine who's going to get identified. This is sort of just some of the steps or the components that go into the evaluation. We can come back to that if you have questions.